Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Thank you for taking some time out to join the collab. I will upload the slides and the recordings probably tomorrow morning, so it'll all be there for you. But thank you for joining, and we will get going. If you've got any questions, feel free just to pop them into the chat if you don't want to ask them, and we'll try and answer them as we go. Is anything I need to update you on? Oh, just, I think you all probably have seen the extension on your assignment date, which is quite nice. We will carry on and have the national support session this Wednesday, mainly because I know there's people working on their assignments, and at least you have time to stick to the original. I'd stick to the original date so that you can keep going with your work and keep up to date rather than having too much compound you in the last bit of time. I will just let you know that I am away for a short while over the next 2 weeks, but I will be checking in most days to check my email. So please just bear with me if I'm not quite as quick as getting back to you as I usually am, but I will be on my emails, and I will check in every day or so and answer any questions. So although I'm not directly around, I will respond to everybody as I can. So just be patient if there's a little time lapse between your question and my response. So the national support session, the link has been sent out, so hopefully we'll see you all then. But yeah, let's get going with this learning unit. And this is learning unit 3, which is chapter 14 in your textbook, and it's on stress, coping, and health. It's probably a chapter we all need to read right now because it's very relevant. It's not a difficult chapter. It's a nice chapter to do because health psychology is very interesting, especially in the times we live in where our stresses are increasing every day, and how we cope with them is very important, and the impact that it has on our well-being. So let's start. Okay, just from your module guide, basically the overview of what this learning unit offers you is it basically introduces you to understanding that human beings are physically and psychologically complex. And we'll understand what healthy lifestyles constitute and look at ways of coping with stress. So the specific learning outcomes for this unit, the first theme is speaking to us around a healthy lifestyle and what that means and how we can deal with health impairing behaviors. And the second theme of the learning unit is all about stress and what stress is and the impact that can have on our well-being. So that's the outline as per your module guide, and you'll notice that we don't cover the entire chapter. There are specific page references, so I will follow what's in the learning outcomes, but I suggest you still work through your chapter in its entirety because just the background information is very important to orientate you to the concept. So for the purpose of this collab, I'll follow the learning unit guide. All right, so we're dealing with health psychology and stress and coping. So why is that so important, and what is health psychology? So we know that health is basically involved with people, and health psychology itself is closely involved in exploring, explaining, and altering people's behaviors, attitudes, and thoughts towards health and illness, and it does that in a number of ways, which we'll go into. So basically, health psychology, it's an interdisciplinary field, which means that it's not always just about psychologists. It's about maybe working together with medical professionals, making it interdisciplinary, and it's concerned with the application of psychological knowledge and techniques in health, illness, as well as health care. So that is sort of in a nutshell what health psychology is, and the fact that it's an interdisciplinary field. So when we look at health psychology, we look at 3 things. We look at stress, our ability to cope with stress, and our overall well-being. So basically, when we look at health from a psychological perspective, it's to examine the impact on the promotion and maintenance of health, the causation, prevention, and treatment of illness. So it's got 2 components to it. One is about health promotion. It's about promoting a healthy lifestyle, being healthy to prevent illness from occurring, but also at the same time, health psychology deals with people to manage health problems. So it's sort of, it's multifaceted in what it can offer to well-being, physical well-being. So again, with psychology, it's the scientific study of psychological and behavioral processes in health, illness, and health care, and the way these processes can influence each other. Okay, so looking at health promotion and managing health problems. So if we look at it from the perspective that, again, let's speak about the biopsychosocial model. So that basically means the interconnection between things. And it just means that biology, which is everything that makes up our physical sort of well-being, from gender to physical illness, immune system functioning, sort of impacts and is impacted on psychology, which is around our attitudes, beliefs, personality, behaviors, all those things we study in psychology, as well as the social context. So what supports us, what social supports, our family background. So all of those three things combine to promote health. Is that healthy well-being and managing health cannot be done in isolation. It has to be looked at from within those three different perspectives, which provides us with what they call the biopsychosocial approach to understanding health. That we can't just look at one thing, we have to look at it in the context of psychology as well as our social situation. So all of those fields are interconnected, which again speaks to why it's multidisciplinary. So that is what health psychology does. So what kind of, if we look at health psychology and we look at it as a concept, then what kind of things could health psychology address if we're thinking about psychological well-being and its impact on health? So things that it could be used is to, for example, and this is from your textbook, to identify behaviors and experience that promote health. So that's about creating healthy lifestyles, but at the same time, things that give rise to illness and influence the effectiveness of health care. Health psychology can help support ways of improving healthcare and healthcare policy. It can be used, for example, to develop ways to reduce smoking, improve daily nutrition, to look at the association between illness and individual characteristics. So, for example, the relationship between personality and thrill-seeking or impulsiveness, hostility and anger, and high-risk driving on the other. It can look at, very importantly, the contextual factors that impact on health. So we'll look at that when it comes to South Africa and the contextual factors in South Africa that can have a significant impact on our healthy well-being. So the following examples of objectives specifically relate to South Africa is to formulate objectives centering on issues such as crime and the environment, and obviously then the impact of that on the psychological well-being of people. It could be something like looking at the impact of informal settlements on the lives of its inhabitants, around poverty, around lack of services, all have impacts on physical and mental well-being. So that is the importance, and that's the relevance that psychology can have to an individual, a community, and even a country. So when we say, what does a healthy lifestyle mean? So we're promoting and we're trying to promote healthy lifestyles to ensure that we are physically well. It's almost like a healthy lifestyle is a preventative way of preventing physical illness. So leading a healthy lifestyle is important. And what a healthy lifestyle means is it's not just about your mental well-being or your physical well-being. It's characterized by health, energy, and vitality. So it's a combination. To be healthy, you have to look at your body. You've got to have a healthy body. You've got to have a healthy mind, and you've got to have a healthy soul. Okay, so the soul is the spirit. It's our meaning and our purpose in life. The spirit, the soul is those psychological areas such as our consciousness and our subconsciousness and our ability to make choices, and our bodily sorry, I'm losing my language today. And the bodily component is everything physical. So it's our nerves, our brain, our organs, our senses. And all of those things have to work together to promote a healthy lifestyle. Body and soul are a psychophysical entity. They're interrelated and you can't separate them. So you can't put your mind in one box and your body in another. They actually work together to create somebody who is healthy, got energy and vitality. So the goal has to be not just to maintain a psychological well-being, but you've got to also have a physical well-being as well, and you've got to have a healthy spirit. So those things operate together. They can't be separated. Okay, we have to look at all of them in conjunction, and they all at the same time impact on each other. So that is what a healthy lifestyle means. It means maintaining that balance between those different entities of our physical well-being. And that's what health psychology promotes in order to have a healthy lifestyle. So you all know that if you have an unhealthy lifestyle, it can lead to many disorders, diseases. So an unhealthy lifestyle can lead to heart disease, it can lead to hypertension, cancer, obesity, diabetes. That there's a lot of direct impacts on our physical well-being of having an unhealthy lifestyle. So it's really important that we maintain that ability to work with our physical and our mental well-being together to prevent disease and things like that happening in our lives. So if we look at illness and we look at illness and wellness and we put them on a continuum where at one end we've got illness so severe that it leads to premature death. And then we've got wellness, which is somebody who's functioning at their optimal level physically and emotionally and all of those things, that it almost gives you a continuum. So on one end, you've got severely ill, and on the other hand, you've got severely, well, not severely well, but that somebody is functioning optimally. And we've got to push people to get to the high level of wellness. So there's a neutral point in the middle where basically there's no discernible illness or wellness, okay? But if somebody is ill, you've got to deal with the physical symptoms, the treatment paradigm of the physical, in order to get to a point where they can move into a position of being well. So illness and wellness operate on this continuum, and the objective is to keep towards the high levels of wellness by making sure that we are maintaining our physical and mental well-being. So it's important to remember that well-being is not just the absence or illness of stress. Okay, so if I'm not sick, it doesn't necessarily mean I'm well. Okay, rather wellness is an active process. So to move into that continuum of high levels of wellness, it's a very active process of being aware of living a healthy and fulfilling life. So that is where a healthy lifestyle comes in. Just because you're not experiencing any symptoms of illness does not necessarily mean you're well. It means that you might just be sort of in that middle point, that neutral point, and you've got to really work towards awareness, education, and to be able to grow into a well and full person. So ultimately, it's important to remember that mental health is closely tied to physical health. Treating them both with care and working on your overall wellness will make you feel better in a number of ways. So that's what health psychology does. It's trying to work towards optimal wellness. So the kind of things that the illnesses and the issues that we deal with in health psychology is obviously we deal with stress. We deal with chronic pain, people in severe pain, and illness as well, like cancer. We look at the process of giving care to somebody and also receiving care. We look at things like personality characteristics and the impact on that, of those on our well-being and our mechanisms of our personality. Some people have their constitutional disposition, as well as health behavior issues. So those are the kinds of things we look at in health psychology in order to ensure wellness. And so when we say that health psychology is about behavior change, it's very much a cognitive sort of process. We have to change the way people think about their own wellness and the way they can think about being healthy or otherwise managing an illness. So ultimately, when we deal with health psychology, it's about trying to look at behavior change to promote wellness. Okay, if you understand that. So the different theories within behavior changes is a health belief model. So basically, in order to improve levels of wellness, people have got to see the good in changing. It is like if you've got somebody who smokes, they've got to understand that by stopping smoking, their physical symptoms will improve and their wellness will improve. But if they don't believe it or they don't see the rewards of that behavior change, they're not going to change. So there's a health belief model. The patient or the client has to really understand that change is for the good and for the better. Stages of change means that people just don't change automatically. Often it is a process of change that people start really contemplating the change before they can, and understanding what it means to them before they get to a point where they can actually start to make the change. So it's not always automatic. It's often why, you know, if you're dealing with changing a behavior around drinking, for example, people are not going to change overnight. You have to introduce the concept to them and let them work through the stages of change. And also community is very important, that psychological wellness, if we look at ourselves as an individual, around us, we've got like an ecosystem of family, of peers, and of a community. So often it's not about an individual, it's about community working together or participating in health, solving health-related problems. So the different theories of change is the health belief model, that people have got to see the good, allow people to work through the stages of change before they can actually make that final step and change their behavior, as well as not just looking at the individual, you have to look at it in terms of their situational context and the people who sit around them to support them. So a community organizational model. Sorry. So it says, discuss how an individual can deal with health impairing behaviors. So what is a health impairing behavior? So a health impairing behavior is a behavior that somebody has that can impair their physical health. So when a person does not function in a normal, healthy way, then a health impairing behavior is likely to manifest. So if we look at health impairing behaviors, and again, these are also behaviors that can be changed. So a health impairing behavior could be smoking. It could be not eating properly, poor nutrition. It could be a lack of exercise, using alcohol or drugs, or engaging in risky sexual behavior. All of those are health impairing behaviors that people are not functioning normally, that these are the behaviors that are manifesting. So when a health impairing behavior manifests, we have to look at it, and how we deal with it is obviously dependent on what that particular problem is and how entrenched it is, how long that person has had the problem. We also have to assess and diagnose and decide on what intervention might be necessary, because remember, every problem, every person, every behavior is very different. So there'll be a process of assessing what is actually needed to help that individual make the change in order to improve their psychophysiological well-being. If medical assistance is needed, then that must be implemented first, because if you remember, with our paradigm, we've got illness and we first have to treat the symptoms, the physical symptoms. So it's really important that when we are looking at health impairing behaviors, we're not forgetting about the physical symptoms that need to be treated. And then you can deal with the psychological component and behavior change. So that is how you can deal with a behavior that is impairing somebody's well-being. Okay, and those are the kinds of things that we see as health impairing behaviors. So if somebody presents to you and they are not eating properly, they are very overweight, obviously that has got a physical impact, and that has to be dealt with first, and then you can start to look at processes to improve their behavior, to improve their well-being. Okay, so those are some of the health impairing behaviors that we can see manifest from problems in our lives. Okay, so that is sort of the first theme, and it's talking about health psychology and what health psychology does. So I hope that's all clear. As you can see, the interdisciplinary nature and dealing with illness and well-being in that continuum. So now we move on, and the biggest part of health psychology is really people's ability to cope with stress and what is stress. And more, the concept of stress and stresses are entering our lives. So this is an interesting section to learn how to cope with stress and the impact that stress has on our physical well-being. So if we talk about stress, what is stress? We say we feel stressed or we're stressed, but what does that actually mean? And if we think about stress and when we experience it, it's an unpleasant emotional state that basically results from the perception of danger. And danger can be anything. It can be something very minor or it can be something very major, but it is that unpleasant emotional state that we find ourselves in. And the stressor that triggers that is basically something in our environment that serves as that source of stress. And it's important that we try to identify what that stressor is in order to help manage our stress. So that's what stress is. Stress is a person's response to events that are threatening or challenging. Okay, so according to Feldman, life is full of circumstances and events. So every day, all day, there are things happening around us. But specific stresses in our lives are those that produce threats to our well-being. Okay, and our attempts to overcome them or it produce biological, psychological responses that result in health problems. So we'll see shortly that there's some stresses that are very minor stresses in our lives and we can cope with them quite easily and we can move on. But there are stresses in our lives that are more acute than others, and it is how we cope with those and overcome them in order to make sure that we are dealing with them and don't have our physical symptoms. So let's look at some stresses. So internal and external examples of stresses. These are things that occur in our everyday life. Hospitalization is a stressor. Buying a home, some of these things you might think, well, that's not stressful, but change is stressful. So buying a home, you can end up with financial obligations that you maybe weren't aware of. You've got a change of environment. It's an example of a stressor. Obviously, conflict within our family, within our working team is an example of a stressor. Fears, some people have significant fears, so therefore the stress level of those fears would be higher. We can engage in our own cognitive stresses of our own making by repetitive thought patterns of things that are happening to us that are negative. We worry about the future. Some of us are pessimists and we worry all the time about whether it's a small thing like waiting for a medical test result or something that's maybe you think you might be retrenched or something like that. We worry about the future all of the time. And sometimes it's a very personal thing. You could have your own unrealistic expectations of yourself. So we impose stresses on ourselves sometimes by having unrealistic expectations. So those are the things that can cause stress in our lives, and stress can lead to physical health problems. Different factors determine whether a particular demand will cause eustress. Eustress was actually a new word for me. It's more like positive stress. So sometimes stress can be positive or distress in a given individual, and different factors. Everybody is unique. These factors are going to be different for everybody. But it's important to look at how we think about our stressor. It's our own appraisal of that stressor and our ability to self-talk and how we think about our own capabilities, our self-concept. Okay, so how we think about it within our own being is really important, and that will help us assess the level of stress. and how we think about the stressor itself, how intensely it creates demands on us, how long it lasts, will all collectively determine whether we experience stress over the handling of any given situation. So it's very unique, and again, that tells us that it's very individualistic in terms of how we think about things and what we let in our environment cause stress on us and how we cope it. So something could be the inability to adjust or adapt to perceptions about the environment, how we think about something. People respond differently, we've said that. And also, it can be a general trait. It's just a general trait of uncomfortable feelings, of anxiety. Some people have a trait of being anxious. You might think that you are more anxious than somebody else. And it's that consistent, continual feeling of anxiety or worry that something is going to happen. And that's what stress is. So if we look at stress and how do we assess stress? How do we assess, in our lives, in our own individual lives? So something happens and we have to use our thinking to really evaluate it. Sometimes that evaluation happens a little bit unconsciously, but other times when we know how to cope, we can make a serious cognitive judgment about the stress in our lives. So the very first thing is sort of when that stress takes place, we basically have a primary appraisal. What is our very first thought about it? And how we think about it then sort of guides us as to what happens next. So in that very first primary appraisal phase, we say, we evaluate whether we have anything at stake in the encounter. So by asking ourselves, does this actually matter for me? Can I just get over it and leave it? Okay, so your primary appraisal will be to perceive the situation as relevant and threatening, means you'll move to a secondary appraisal approach. If we see the situation as irrelevant or harmless, then we're done, we've assessed it, and we can carry on. Okay, so it's where we perceive the situation as relevant and threatening to us, we need to move on to a secondary appraisal process. And often these stresses happen in our lives and they're sort of fleeting and we know we can cope with them. But at that moment when you say, I can't cope with this, or this is out of my control, or I don't have the resources to deal with it, we have to move to a secondary appraisal. So it's very cognitive. When we get to the secondary appraisal, is we look at it in two ways. And one way determines whether that's actually going to cause significant stress or whether we can actually, again, move on. So if we assess something as being stressful to us, but then we think about it and we believe that we've got the resources to be able to cope with that, so we can cope with it. It's not a problem. If I do X, Y, and Z, I can get over it and move on. Generally, that's going to also alleviate stress and you will be able to move on. But where we get to a secondary appraisal point where we feel we can't cope with it, we don't have the resources, it's going to be too exhausting, we just can't deal with it, that is where the true stress then manifests. So in secondary appraisal, we evaluate existing coping resources. How healthy are we to deal with this? How much energy do we have? Whether we've got people around us who can help. So I've got a problem, but I know I can go to my friends and my friends will help me solve it. Therefore, my stress can be eliminated. Do we feel we can rise to the challenge? That's our self-concept. Can we cope with this problem? Yes, I can cope with it. I've got belief in myself. I know how to deal with it. I can move on. Is it going to cost me money? I can cope with it. I have the financial resources. I can move on. But if we believe we lack those resources to deal with the situation, okay, we get a perception of negative stress. Conversely, if we believe we have the necessary resources, the stressor won't overwhelm us and instead sometimes can be perceived as a positive stress. So for example, an adolescent girl with limited social and financial support might view being pregnant as a negative stress. Okay, no money, no resources to deal with it, stress. Well, a middle-aged woman who's married, maybe has got adequate financial and social support, might see pregnancy as an exciting and hopeful time. Okay, so pregnancy, for example, is your stressor. I can cope with it. I've got resources. It's what I wanted. No stress, not a problem. Somebody who doesn't have the resources, who doesn't have maybe the emotional or physical well-being to cope with it, our pregnancy can then be a stress. So again, it's very individualistic, and it depends very much on the situational factors that we find around ourselves. So when we look at stress, we have things that are acute stress and we have chronic stress. So we've taken the idea that there's stress and we've accepted it. So what is acute stress? So acute stress is generally something that's short-lived, okay? It gets resolved, whatever that stress is, and it moves on. It's got a clear end point. So I know I've got an exam coming up. I'm exceptionally stressed about my exam, but I will study hard. But I know in a week's time, when my exam is done, it will be over. So for that week prior to the exam, I will be suffering from, maybe, if I can't cope with it, acute stress. Okay, so it could be something like having to do a presentation at work, concerns about something that's upcoming, a situation or event, maybe an argument, or running late, or you're stuck in traffic. Okay, those are acute stresses. They're significant because they do impact on our physical well-being, but they're generally over and done with. And it's understanding that and that you can cope with it allows you to cope with the stress and move on. But sometimes stress is chronic. Okay, that means that it's ongoing. It's a much longer duration. It's got no clear end point. So a bad relationship can cause chronic stress. A stressful job can cause chronic stress. A toxic home environment. If you live in an area of high crime, if you don't sleep properly, that you have poor sleep habits can cause chronic stress, and you have ongoing health problems. Maybe cancer or diabetes or something like that. Those are chronic stresses. So there's obviously a difference between the two, and again, how we frame them to ourselves and how we cope with them really depends on the kind of stress that we're experiencing. So there's two subtypes, acute and chronic. So what are our major types of stress? What is these things that are causing stress in our lives? So a type of stress is frustration. We can get very frustrated. Basically, a frustration, it means is that where you've got a goal and you can't achieve your goal, you get frustrated. And everybody deals with frustrations differently. Most frustrations we experience in our lives are brief and insignificant. We get frustrated for a period of time, we move on. But sometimes frustration can be more significant. So failure, where we set our goals too high for ourselves, can be failure. Okay, and that is frustration. We're not achieving our goals, we get frustrated. If we have loss, we're deprived of something we're used to having, we get frustrated. So frustration is a cause or major type of stress that we experience in our lives. Conflict as well is another significant type of stress. And so basically when we talk about conflict, we're saying there's two or more incompatible motivations or impulses that are competing to be expressed. So when we look at conflict, there's an approach conflict. And so that's where you are in a position where you're caught between two goals, but both of them are positive, but there's a conflict because you don't know which goal to choose. Neither one, they're both as good as each other. So for example, should I play soccer or should I play cricket? It can cause anxiety, is that conflict between those two things. Should I have pizza for supper or should I have spaghetti for supper? Can cause anxiety and stress. What to wear today? Should I wear the blue jersey or the gray jacket? Those are approach types of conflicts that cause stress. Avoidance conflict is when a person is caught between two things, both have negative sort of outcomes. So if I'm in a position where I really hate my job, I don't like it, I don't like being at work, the job is meaningless, the environment I find myself in is toxic, but what's my alternative? My alternative is unemployment. Okay, so that's avoidance conflict, is those two negative variances. Do I live with painful backache or do I have surgery? Are two avoidance types of conflict. An approach avoidance conflict is basically when you're caught between a positive and a negative goal for yourself. So approach avoidance, do I date an attractive person or do I face rejection? you can see the conflict there. Do I go on the date because he's attractive, but at the same time, I know that I suffer from low self-esteem and I could get rejected. Do I invest money and this is a good investment return? Oh, but I don't want to lose money and I could lose my capital. Okay, so it's a positive and a negative outcome, and the conflict is sitting in the middle there deciding which way you'll go. So conflict is a major type of stress. Change. Okay, so we said about the house and about moving, and change causes stress. I think we all know that. We have to experience change often. Even signing up for a psychology course and signing up for distance learning is, you want to do it, but at the same time, it's going to, you know, take away your time, take away time from your family. But you know that it's change for the good, and you'll get a promotion if you do it. But it's about change, and life changes, specifically life changes, is significant alterations in one's living circumstances that require readjustment. Even sometimes events that you think are positive can cause stress because they require you to change. So there's a rating of what are the most stressful life changes someone can go through. Death of a spouse is the first one. Divorce, separation, imprisonment, death of a family member, personal injury or illness, marriage. You might think marriage is for the good, you love your partner, but the change that marriage brings about can cause stress. Dismissal from work, marital reconciliation, retirement is a stress. So significant life changes that take place cause stress, and it's about understanding those and finding ways to cope with them that positive psychology deals with. Pressure is another major type of stress. So pressure is basically the expectation or demand that we behave in a certain way. Society puts pressure on us to behave or act in a certain way, but it might be very contrary to what we want to do. So there's that pressure of expectation from our parents, from work, from school, from family. Pressure can also be self-imposed. It's like we said, setting goals that are too high for yourselves. We're pressurizing ourselves to achieve things that maybe our expectations of our own ability are too high. Pressure from our partners, peer relations. So a very strong relationship has been found between pressure and a variety of psychological symptoms and problems. And studies link high levels of pressure to heart disease. So that ongoing pressure, if you're in a negative work environment and you've got pressure all the time to perform, can lead to things like heart disease and maybe a stroke. So those are the major types of stresses that we find. I'll click the next page. Let's just see. There we go. So now we have stress. We've got all of these stresses in our lives. We've got acute stress and chronic stress. We've got frustration and pressure and conflict. So it's about coping. So to prevent stress from manifesting in physical ways, we have to find ways to deal with stress. And it's very much about how we think. It's very much a cognitive paradigm. And we do learn to cope with stress. We cope with it as part of our daily lives. But at the same time, stress can compound, and cumulative stress, ongoing stress that is consistently in our lives can compromise our ability to deal with it, because those negative experiences, they compound over time. Okay, so that's about dealing with just consistent and cumulative stress. So we talk about constructive coping. That is trying to find a way of positively deal with stress, and we'll come onto this just a little bit later, but I put it in here. So the APA, the Psychological Association, their definition of constructive coping is any instrumental approach to stress management that's considered generally to be adaptive or otherwise positive. So examples of that can include planning and strategizing, so important, seeking help and support from others, reframing the situation, i.e. changing how we're looking at a situation to see if that helps us cope with it better, and even meditating, okay, are ways of actually constructively coping with stress in our lives. And we'll move on to discuss that in a little bit more detail shortly. So part of the obviously what we look at in this work that we do is we look at contextualizing it in our own country. And again, in South Africa, every country experiences things like that. But in some instances in South Africa, there are levels of things that take place in our environment that are likely to induce stress, probably more so than in other countries. And what's on the left there is really just a snapshot of what causes stress in our society based on our current economic, environmental circumstances and what's happening. So unemployment is a significant cause of stress in South Africa. Our unemployment rates are very high. And so if you've got such high unemployment rates, the psychological well-being of a large number of people is going to be compromised through unemployment. Crime is an incredible stressor in our country. Corruption causes stress. Just thinking about corruption gives me anxiety and causes stress within me. Poverty is very rife. Okay, so you can see if you had to do like a well-being index of South Africa, as it were, because we as a country are experiencing some of these high levels of unemployment, crime, corruption, we have poor education systems, we've got potholes in our roads. And I mean, this does paint a negative picture. We always have to reframe and look at the positive. But it's just saying that in our country, when we look at health psychology and we look at community health and well-being, we're not going to fare very well on a well-being index, if you had to put it like that. So we have to work at very much from a community health perspective, is to improve the wellness of our community by addressing how people cope with these issues that happen in society. So something I found online is the medical scheme ProfMed has published the results of its latest stress index. Well, I think that's probably what I put above there, highlighting how the COVID-19 pandemic, the national lockdown and other factors have impacted on the mental health of professionals in South Africa. The group defines the feeling of stress as a set of physical sensations such as muscle tension as a direct result of feeling overwhelmed and anxious. This in turn is caused by overthinking and the inability to rest and recover. So if you had to look from a health psychology perspective, I mean, what do you think the impact of COVID-19 has been on the overall psychological well-being of our community? Okay, more suicides, more people feeling anxious, more people feeling stressed, worried about whether they were going to have a job, worried about whether they were going to get sick. But all of those things were compounding. That period of 2 years, when we talk about compounding stress, those 2 years have significantly compounded stress for a lot of us. Okay, so that's a very nice example of stress and how it can compound over time and get worse. And I mean, those are some of the figures that I got offline about the crime statistics in our country. And remember, if you've been a victim of crime, your anxiety levels or your stress levels are going to be a lot higher than maybe somebody who actually directly hasn't been through that experience. But we live with those stresses every day. These are statistics that are always put in front of us on the radio, on the television, that, you know, they are causing acute and sometimes chronic stress in our lives. So it's important to look at the context and look at the individual as they sit within the ecosystem in which they live, if that makes sense to you all. I hope your stress levels are low. If they're not starting to feel anxious, just breathe. Okay. So the response to stress, how do we respond? How does our body respond to stress? So this Hans Sale is somebody who worked with a physiological response to stress. And it's not the stress that kills us, it's our reaction to the stress, which is very true. Okay, so you don't die of stress, you die of something that's related to stress, but it is our reaction to it. If we can cope with it, we can deal with it. If we can't cope with it, our reaction to it, it potentially can cause death, okay, through physical illness. So when we experience stress, and we remember back to that fight or flight response to something in our environment that is causing stress, when we have that stress, our adrenaline starts to pump. Remember that how we experience stress, our heart rate increases, our breathing increases, our blood pressure rises, we release sugar from the liver, our muscle tension increases. So our body, when we experience stress, starts to pump out adrenaline. And it also starts to pump out cortisol, which is our inbuilt alarm system. But too much cortisol. So if we're permanently under stress, too much cortisol in our system can suppress our immune system. So we start to get sick. So there is definitely a physiological response to stress within the secretion of hormones. And what Hans Sale did is he did something called the general adaptation syndrome. So basically, if we're experiencing stress over a longer term, what is our response to it? So our very first response to it is alarm. It's the autonomic nervous system's reaction. Our fight or flight processes are mobilized. We become quite clear in our thinking, our emotions, our mental state. We have that phase one, which is like our alarm reaction. So we fight or we flight or we do whatever. However, if that stress continues, okay, you start to be able to try to adapt to it and cope with it. It's like a resistance phase. So we're starting to deal with it. We still have levels of arousal, but at the same time, our body is sort of seeking to rest and restore itself and to keep our energy levels up so that we can cope with the stress. It's like the second phase. But if it gets to a point where this continues, we basically get exhausted. And it just means our reserves are depleted and we just can't cope anymore. And that's where our ability to be resistant to the stress is gone and it becomes hazardous to our health. So our strength and our energy level drops very low. And stress-related medical conditions like anxiety and depression and inflammation can occur. So it's our ability to cope with short-term stress, where our body is mobilized to react to it, where we can carry on responding to that stressor if we look after our body, that we're sort of resting, feeding it, putting nutritions in our body, having clear thinking, but it gets to a point where we're just exhausted. And you hear people say that, they say, I'm exhausted, my reserves are depleted, and I can't deal with this problem anymore. And that's where the physical illness sets in. So that is the response to stress that we go through. Stress also impacts on our immune system. So it's called and I'm going to try and say it, psychoimmunology. Sometimes it's better to read it than it says it. So that's basically the interaction between our thoughts and emotions, our brain and our nervous system, and our immune system. So it's the study of interaction between physiological, psychological processes, our nervous system and our immune system. So the little picture at the bottom says, we've just got our test back. I hate to look. I hope I didn't get a D-. They say a D- can impair the function of your immune system and disrupt the chemical balance of your body. Sorry, body. Okay, so it's about the link between stress and our nervous system and our immune system can be compromised. So social stresses produce the greatest impact on the immune system. So what it does is those lymphocytes that fight disease in our body are suppressed. Stress can lead to a decrease in our immune system response. That's why often when people are under stress, they get sick because their immune system has been run down or is depleted. So there's a link between stress and our immune system. So the effect of continued ongoing stress will influence biological functioning of the human body, okay? Because we've got those stress hormones that are continually secreted. We've got our digestion slowing down, our heart rate is on the increase, we breathe quickly. All of those things, our stress response impacts on our physical well-being. So psychologically, stress levels prevent people from adequately coping with life. Okay, so stress can increase your vulnerability to becoming ill. It can cause illness. Stress will help prevent us from being able to recover from illness. And stress may reduce our ability to cope with future stresses. So when we spoke about cortisol and we said that during the fight or flight and our body pumps out cortisol, if you've got high cortisol in your blood, if it's consistently high over a long period of time due to chronic stress, for example, you can start to experience health consequences. So that stress builds up over time. The cortisol is now building to levels that cause significant physical problems. High cortisol levels can cause anxiety, depression, fatigue, constipation, bloating, headaches, heart disease, high blood pressure, irritability, problems with memory, reproductive issues, sleep difficulties, slow recovery from exercise, and weight gain. So all of that is an impact, the physical impact on our body of experiencing stress and not being able to find ways to cope with stress. So when we look at the effects of stress, we have got physiological effects. That's in my body, what is happening in my body. My blood pressure increases, which puts strain on my heart. Our immune system is decreased. We have increased hormonal activity. We have psychophysical disorders, which are physical disorders worsened by emotional factors like asthma, hypertension, headaches. Okay, we've got effects of stress being harmful behaviors. So harmful behaviors manifest: smoking, alcohol, poor nutrition, decreased sleep, increased drug use. And we've got negative health-related behaviors. So stress, people who experience stress could also have a decreased likelihood of seeking medical advice, increased delay in seeking medical advice, and decreased compliance with medical advice. Okay, so even when the negative behavior is being shown or experienced, people still, okay, don't manage their stress and they seek avoidance of medical attention. So that is, there's serious effects on our physical well-being and stress. So how do we cope with stress? Okay, we can cope with daily situations, okay, very simply how we frame them, how we look at them, the resources in our arsenal to cope with them. But negative experiences compound over time, as we said. So coping is our ability to learn, reduce, or control threats that lead to stress. So you almost like need to have a coping arsenal of how you cope with things. And like we said, constructive coping is a very positive approach. It's about being proactive and understanding how we cope with stress. So healthful efforts that people make to deal with stress, that is what constructive coping is. So some people, they break it down into sort of three categories. This one set of strategies is appraisal, how we look at the situation, okay, how we think about it. So we detect when we're talking negatively about ourselves. We look and we say, oh, we're talking negatively about ourselves. Let's change it. I know that. I need to change it. You could start to think, okay, I need to start to think about this, how I assess it, how I think about it. Maybe an appraisal is finding humor in a situation, or even turning to religion. If somebody's chronically stressed, they might find support or assistance in spiritual guidance. Then there's problem-focused strategies. That's where you actively say, well, I've got this stress. I'm going to really try and solve it. I'm going to ask for help. I'm going to improve my time management. I'm going to improve my ability to control myself. I'm going to be more assertive. It's looking at the problem and having a problem-focused strategy. And then another way you can deal with it is through emotion-focused strategy. So releasing those pent-up emotions, distracting yourself, managing the feelings that you're having, those hostile feelings. Meditating is another emotional way of coping with it, using relaxation procedures or techniques that you might find. So it's very much trying to calm your emotions and to try and find ways to relieve stress. So those are all positive, constructive coping strategies. And if we're aware of them and we're aware of how to cope, we can manage the stress in our lives so much better. And sometimes people have negative approaches. There's avoidant coping and becoming very defensive so you don't have to cope with it, or having emotional insinuation, blaming your emotions on something else and just avoiding that emotional focus strategy of coping. So that is how we cope with stress. And I think we're sort of at the end. So again, how do we deal with it? How do we deal? We've got our coping strategies for dealing with it, but it's important. We're looking at promoting a healthy lifestyle, healthy well-being, reducing stress in our lives, eat properly, eat clean. Okay, we all know what a healthy diet means. Stay active. Being physically active can reduce the stress in your life. Always talk to somebody. Okay, having people around you is a way of coping. Problem shared is a problem halved, they say. Talk your feelings out and learn to relax. Learn to take that breath when you feel it's becoming overwhelming. Take that breath and learn to relax, and that's how we manage stress. So that's the end of it, guys. That somehow felt like a self-help session rather than a psychology lesson, but you can see from that how vulnerable we all are to stress because of who we are, our uniqueness, where we live, who we interact with. But it's really important to know the link between psychological well-being and physical well-being. So has anyone got any questions? Or is that all good for everyone? All good? Okay, great. I hope that was useful. Any questions, you guys are free to send me an email. We've got our NSS, just a reminder, on Wednesday night. So I hope you all had a good understanding of health psychology. And health psychology is a good branch of psychology to get into. Yep, going to eat clean now, exercise, deep breath, and talk to someone if you need help. Yeah, reduce our stress, really important. Well done, Lou. Thanks, guys. Have a good evening. I'm just going to